Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Washington State Government reporter Carlene Johnson, and joining me for today's podcast is the Center Square's investigative reporter TJ Martinell, who has been covering a bill early in session. I think the first version of this thing passed, and now we've got the next version. The state Senate passing a bill regulating the presence of out-of-state National Guard, which prompts my first question to you, TJ. What the heck inspired this, and what is the need for this bill?
That is the $1 million question, though we might want to say 1 billion due to inflation. But that is the question. The question is, what scenario would prompt them to think that this bill is necessary? And they've really not given any specific scenarios other than National Guard unit operating in Washington State, and they make inferences to them carrying out the president's agenda, right? Or enforcing federal laws or something like that. But they don't say what federal laws, they don't say whatever context it is. And here's a couple of problems with the trying to thread this needle. This doesn't apply if the president deploys into active service the National Guard. So if he took National Guard units from Idaho, brought them into Washington State, but they were under active service, this bill wouldn't apply. So this bill only applies if it's a state governor doing this. So a state governor sending their National Guard units into Washington State, they haven't been federalized, they're not under the authority of the president, and they're enforcing federal laws or something like that. So the question is, what scenario, what circumstances? But here's the more important thing. How is a state law going to stop them at that point? In what context? Because if they're going to be bringing them in, and if they're going to be enforcing federal laws against the wishes of the governor, and if it's right, if it happens in the next 4 years, presumably, unless he resigns, Governor Ferguson, he says you can't be here. And they ignore it, and then Attorney General Nick Brown files a lawsuit. He goes to court. How is a court order going to stop them?
Right.
The circumstances under which this would make sense is if the governor sent National Guard units into the state to cooperate with federal agencies in enforcing federal laws. And the president wasn't telling them what to do, but they were cooperating together, right?
Right.
That's where they could say, hey, you guys can't be operating in our state, even if it's to enforce federal laws. You need to leave.
So
now the one part that I haven't quite figured out is why would they not be called into active service of the president? So here's an interesting scenario, because we're going to do a little bit of war gaming here. Imagine that let's just hypothetical, but since it's kind of the more obvious one, but we'll use either Idaho or Texas just for fun. Let's say Idaho or Texas had National Guard units flown into one of the U.S. Air Force bases in Washington State, whether in Spokane or Lewis McChord Joint Air Force Base. Landed them there. The National Guard units operated strictly within the base's perimeter, and they were helping federal agencies process illegal immigrants or others that are being set for deportation.
Okay.
And let's say that the governor or the attorney general's office filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court, which is where it most likely would occur. Here's the problem. Let's say the U.S. court judge says the troops need to be withdrawn from Washington State, yet they're on a U.S. military base. And President Trump forbids the Air Force or the Army from carrying out the order. How is the state going to go onto a federal base with Washington National Guard units to kick them out, or Washington State Patrol? They have no jurisdiction.
No jurisdiction on the base, right?
And here's the other problem. If Washington State were to send in their National Guard to try and enforce this, all President Trump would have to do is federalize them. And now they can't do anything except what the president tells them to do. So this is going to be a very interesting scenario that could potentially occur, where you could have, it would be different if they brought in the National Guard on foot, like they drove them in with vehicles, or that their equipment and supplies and men were stationed outside of federal lands.
Well,
right?
this isn't happening. This isn't happening, right? I mean, you just painted a potential scenario.
Yeah, this is a potential scenario, but this is a scenario where the only scenarios where it makes sense, where that you have National Guard units still under the authority of their governors, not the president. They're on federal land. They're on a secure military Air Force base that's run by the president, and they're helping process illegal immigrants or others who are set for deportation, or they've collected, they're part of the cartels or whatever it is, but they aren't leaving the base. Their activities are strictly confined to that base. And then the governor and the attorney general's office file a lawsuit in U.S. federal court. The federal court judge says they need to leave. Who's going to enforce it on what jurisdiction? And it would create this legal entanglement of it's federal property. And if they don't gain access or permit access, the state can't enter it. And if the only units that they could send in there would be National Guard units that could be called into active service by the president. And you can't send in the Washington State Patrol. So they would have to rely on the federal government cooperating in that sense, but they're the ones who are enabling it to happen. The only thing that I haven't quite figured out with this bill is what advantage would there be for the president to not federalize these National Guard units from, say, Idaho or Texas? What advantage would there be or benefit to having them under the authority of the governors? There might be.
TJ, the sponsor here, Representative Charlotte Mena, Democrat from Tacoma. Is that, I mean, has she said on the record, my motivation for this is because this crazy Donald Trump is going to try to, do whatever he has to go in and, take illegal immigrants, they would undocumented citizens, and remove them from our communities, and we're not going to allow it. And so this is in response to that. I mean, has she been that on the up and up about it, or otherwise the motivation for it seems, I don't know. It doesn't make any sense because this is not happening anywhere.
It's not happening, but I think the thing is with these bills, there's two possibilities. One, it's kind of just a symbolic gesture.
Yeah.
But the other one is that they've done the same kind of wargaming I have, and they're anticipating any possible contingency, and they are looking at their legal options. Now, if the president were to call them into active service, there's nothing they can do about it legally or practically because they're under the authority of the president, and the president can send National Guard into the state if he wants to under those circumstances. And just the same way that you have the federal military in Washington state. So this is concern of other states sending in their National Guard. And again, like for people who are listening, this is merely a wargaming scenario and a potential hypothetical, but it's one of the few hypotheticals I've thought of where all this stuff applies. Because if you say, oh, the president's sending in National Guard from Idaho or Texas that are called in active service, and even the bill sponsor and other supporters have said this doesn't apply if the president calls them in. So they're worried about state governors acting on their own initiative in that sense. And so, but then again, they're probably not thinking of what I just thought of, where if the National Guard units are on federal property, a court order is still not going to matter. So they're envisioning a scenario where National Guard units are in Washington state. They're not on secure federal land, but they are aiding federal law enforcement agencies with, like, say, immigration enforcement or deportations. So I guess it's the reality is they can pass a law saying that, and a court judge can order them to be withdrawn. The question is then, under what circumstances would a court order, like, who's going to enforce it at that point?
And I think that this conversation at this point seems to only sort of escalate the tensions between Washington state and the federal government. I mean, now we've got Washington Doge, right? The bill from GOP Chairman Jim Walsh attempting to, kind of do on the state level what's been done on the national level to look at, inefficiencies in state agencies. But it seems like this is going to be another thing where it's like Washington's over here going, hey, pay attention to us because we don't like what you're doing on the federal level in any way, shape, or form. It seems like it could bring more negative attention to the state, at least from the federal administration's perspective.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that Washington State seems to be in this very weird relationship with the federal government, where they're trying to break loose of any control from the federal government at the same time that they want them to not stop sending the checks, to not stop sending the money. And this situation also, I mean, there's potential political implications for it in terms of state relations, where I think it's just the big question, like I was saying, the $1 billion question is, what are they worried is going to happen? And are they worried about anything at all? Because this is a bill that you look at and say, this bill is only necessary if this were to be a likely scenario to occur, where you have National Guard units entering the state under the authority of their governors against the wishes of our governor. And it hasn't escalated to where it's not a confrontation between the state National Guard, our state National Guard, and theirs.
And just to be clear, this doesn't preclude, because I'm thinking of like when you do hear about Washington National Guard members getting called up to other states, right, in cases of bad fire or floods, whatever. That's a federal response, right? So this doesn't preclude if we should find ourselves in dire need of some additional help, right?
So, so that is the question is, and this is still something to, we can still continue doing wargaming. I might have an answer at some point, is why would the governors not just have the president call them into active service and sidestep this law entirely? There has to be something that gives the governors either leniency or a legal loophole to where some federal statute doesn't apply to them, and where they can be in the state and they're not subject to whatever it is. Maybe they're not subject to a federal law that the president of the United States is subject to. Or maybe it just creates a jurisdictional confusion, because if they got a conflict with the federal government, then it's clear what's going on. But if it's an interstate conflict, that raises some very interesting questions that have really never been tested legally, because the only time that a state has sent in its National Guard into another state against the wishes of that state was during the Civil War.
Civil War, yeah.
And the reality is, a state law is not going to prevent. A state law does not practically prevent things. I mean, if it did, then we wouldn't have crimes. We would just pass laws banning them and nobody would do them. So I think it's a very fascinating bill that's not really getting discussed as much as it might be, because it's like if they passed a law regarding an invasion or some like very serious and very niche topic. So, I mean, I filed records requests, and we're going to continue doing some digging into figuring out just what inspired this bill. But at some point, it warrants asking the governor and others who have supported this to say, specifically, can you name a single scenario where this would apply?
Right. I more, positioning. Certainly Governor Ferguson has made no secret about his disdain for the Trump administration. So,
right. But again, this doesn't concern Trump. This concerns state governors. Right. But in his inaugural speech, he said, his fear is they would come here to carry out the president's agenda. So the question is, why would they be carrying out the president's agenda on their own terms and not his? So.
He's going to sign this thing into law, though, right? It's a done deal at this point.
I mean, I can't imagine him not signing it, but it ain't over till it's over.
I can't wait to hear what you find in your public records requests, if those are responded to in a timely fashion, as they're supposed to be. Thank you, TJ Martineau, for the story. If you want to read the story and more like it, at thecentersquare.com. I encourage you to do that and follow up this story with TJ further. Thank you for watching Washington in Focus. I'm Carlene Johnson.